Taking poetry classes next semester. Did you have you taken the poetry workshop while you were here? Interesting.
I was telling them like I haven't really dedicated a workshop, not school, so I like so yeah, I just took a poetry workshop in Thomastown. And it was in Ireland, so and we stay very close, so that's really learning people are very.
We're now live. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
We're very
Sure. Cortez, are you doing the intro? Okay.
The bio?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're not good at that. All right. So now I'm gonna say something.
We're welcoming Tracy O'Neill. She's killer. Here she is.
Hi guys, thanks so much for having me. So I wasn't exactly sure about the format of this event prior, so I didn't exactly cut this story that I was going to read. So I'm just gonna I guess I'll just read like the first, I don't know, 2/3. So it's called Put a Finger. Itinerarily speaking, the trip to Angie's entailed zoning out on Flora Flash through train window till the upper slapped around my torso like a waving, unwound gut so every leaf torched out and textures babbled at my eyes. Halfway there, a guy from whom I had purchased holistic medicine that happened to be pot sent me a party invitation. My answer suggested I would like to come, but was obliged to tend to my infirm sister, which was not genealogically true, though some essence of beauty, which was truth, beauty, might be recognized, since for years people referred to us, Angie and I, as the Siamese twins, so long as they were fatuous morons, which was common. I didn't know you have a sister, said the next text, as though my former drug dealer knew much about me at all. Had he, sister might have struck him as metaphor. Angie and I had been friends long enough to know things about each other no one else knew. Barack Obama was the safe word she used with her husband, for example. He would bring out a candle, drip wax, then make like he was going to burn her hair, and she would scream, "Barack Obama." It did the trick for her, I guess. At 23, Angie had wanted tousled hair, notoriety, French wine, and French cigarettes, culminating in a tragic French death demarcated by carnations. She'd wanted travel and to throw a lover under the bus at sunset. We'd met circa then, downing $1 a dozen dumplings off Chinatown styrofoam, then kept meeting. I told her I borderline mugged a restaurant manager who'd stolen my tips, and she admitted her own low-key atrocities. Years out, we hadn't, as promised, lived to be spinsters in side-by-side flop houses, but when I thought of her, I beheld in my mind a spinning drunk in sloppy tilt-floor apartments, beautiful, as she laughed at all the pretty colors. An incitement to standard issue revelry, therefore, wouldn't tempt me off seeing Angie, especially given her deterioration, whereas I presumed my former drug dealer, with whom I had once had anaerobic disaffected group sex, would have quite enough fun without me, as he had even when at the orgy I was present. How old? He asked. She can come too. Then, wait, sick with what? I crunched more lunch of speed and orange juice, pensive. I'd suspected something wrong since a recent call. On the phone, Angie had sunk into a low parochial mood, edging excitement. She wanted to import a screw-up uncle from Seoul for her kid's baptism. The husband, who cares what his opinion was, didn't. For cycles, she sighed. I wutted. Finally, she suggested that I, of course, would not comprehend, since, having lost all the what's-his-names I'd left, I was 35 and responsible to no one. At the time, she was upstate, I mid, absent facial affect. The only thing to do was muster ginger vocals. And so, softly in the smartphone, I reminded Angie it could be worse. I could, for instance, be the stepmother of 3 bedwetters named Nicholas, Henry, and Bellwether, ages 7, 8, and 15, respectively. I had nearly done that once, as you might recall, but one what's-his-name turned angry when I kept telling him he'd bred a bunch of future serial killers. I suggested he educate himself on the centrality of nocturnal enuresis in the psychopath test, as well as gendered labor, after he asked me to launder the boys' bedclothes. Back then, Angie would say, "Don't you know love is work, love is compromise?" But I wasn't going to change someone else's creepy kid's pee sheets when I more or less didn't want to change my own hypothetical kids' pee diapers. I told Bellwether he, a probable teenage Looney Tune who never did chores due to spoiling features of the patriarchy, had proverbially, if not entirely materially, made that pee bed for himself, so now he could lie in it. And his father said, "Don't call my kid a Looney Tune," and I left him so I could call his kid whatever the fuck I wanted. "Yes," I replied when Angie asked if I was saying what I had just said. "I would rather be old and alone and make fun of children." "I have to get dinner on the table," she said, which evidently she had to do every night. I hung up the phone. My rental cabin was filled with the owner's less favored furniture. At the miniature stained glass window by the stairs to the lofted area, a view turned toward yellow, pink, and orange outside crap. I wondered what Angie prepared for dinner, but not very hard. Still, a queer feeling remained. Thinking of Angie in her kitchen, the edge of baffle was on me. A raccoon took a wormy dump on the windowsill. I decided to bother reflecting, but my finger wasn't put on anything. My life was, by all numeric accounts, too expensive, but it was not bad. There was the sansara of scrolling my phone. I memorized a heart-pumping series of squat thrusts and burpees and recorded myself reading Martin Buber's I Am Thou in cartoon voices. For 2 hours a day in profit, I tutored rich kids whose parents wanted them to do better than everyone else's children via video conference. And if I was dispirited by the inequitable distribution of legs up in the world, I would drill them on the wrong physics equations. Then, when they repeated what I'd just taught them, berate them. Only in a blue moon would I wake still drunk, having sent humiliating texts to my mother like, "I miss you," or "I could take a bus home for Christmas." The raccoon vacated the window frame. I went up to the loft and looked down on my life below, the cheap Nordic trappings and ashtrays, black underwear. From there, it occurred to me that something young, unbothered, true was in trouble. Prior even to the pandemic, if I thought about it, Angie rarely anymore let a night persist until our teeth turned purple singing wild horses. Instead, she would call to update me on the baby, then commence diagnosing people we used to know with narcissistic personality disorder. She enumerated things that were no longer tolerable, quote unquote, as a mother, like near poverty and crazy people. Issuing repetitive grievances about her husband's stymieing income, neighborhood demographics, and the success of more successful peers, she was probably frightened at the loneliness of losing herself. I empathized. And so, the night of the call, many miles between us, I did what I could. When I was a girl and we were fresh here from Korea, my mother had taught me to mosey to the peace of the woods, shoot a gun. What I did, I piled sticks and cans, gun loaded, my forehead pulled off, and helium poured down my skull, throwing blue light through the fat perforations of eye cavities. I raised my arm, said pow, and on firing, it sounded nothing like pow at all. And my hand was still and my heart was not. And in the distance, birds sprang from trees freed by fear. Outside the rental, where somewhere that raccoon still wandered, I shot my shot. I did it again. I pinched that trigger until I knew what the ticket was, and it was a train ticket. I bought the 543 to Angie's town. "She'll be okay," I told my drug dealer. Dialogue done, I replaced the phone in a pocket and cozied into the chug of my drugged heart. The conductor or one of his hierarchical underlings did little verifying double punches, slid tickets into their seat top clasps. Shooting through the suburbs, brightness clutched every inner edge, Olympian and gold. The train hit pace again past go without collecting $200. I thought of being pleasantly surprising when Angie opened the door. I counted red objects blue in an accident of imagination. I saw us, Angie and I, jumping in the night, stumbling arm in arm. When she heaved, I held her hair back, and when she rose, she held mine. Time poured, seamless as water, and devastating distance in that box on rail. I was immense. As I watched a sparse man torture mustard from a foil packet, a reserve of largesse welled. I called him sir. "Sir," I beseeched, then laughed in startle of my own volume. "Be gentle with that little mutard." Okay, so that's just the beginning of that story.
Thank you so much for being here. Sure. Do we need the microphone or can we just shout out?
What we need right now is for Elaine to come adjust the camera first.
Okay.
And so we'll filibuster until then.
Sure, yeah. Well, in the meantime, can you hear me? Is it projecting? Okay. We could just shout out. I don't think it's a sound is coming up. Not on. I would assume that's the circle. It takes a little bit. And that's. I think it's last screen.
Okay, well, because you read us a short story, I had a question cooking that's basically like, when you get an idea, is it immediately clear to you the shape it's going to take? Like this is going to be a short story or this is going to be a novel, or how does that generally come together for you?
I think that I tend to know that something's going to be a short story when I write it. But my first book actually began as a short story. It was like 4 pages. And essentially I had done a reading, and this agent approached me at this reading, and she took me out to dinner, and she was sort of like, well, what have you got for me? And I said, oh, I have that short story. I have a couple others, and I would really like to do a collection. And of course she said the thing that everybody in publishing says, which is, well, nobody wants to publish collections. And so I was very bummed out about that in the moment. I didn't know anything about publishing. But then I sort of thought, I still wanted to spend time with that character. So I ended up turning that into a novel.
Awesome. That's really interesting. I have only touched fiction very recently because we're all in Robert's multiple genre class. And I mean, you're an expert on that because you've written 2 novels, but you also write nonfiction essays. And one thing I'm coming up against is like this exploration in different genres is really exciting for me, but it's accompanied by this fear that if I don't really like choose one mostly, that I won't have like an identity as a writer. I wonder if you've had to overcome a fear like that, or if not, just what your general philosophy is or experience of writing in multiple genres.
So the answer would be no. But, I think that lots of writers work either across genre or are hybridizing. So, I mean, I'm a huge Joan Didion fan, for instance. And of course, Didion wrote essays, did journalism, wrote novels, wrote screenplays. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's perfectly fine to make those movements. And also, I mean, I certainly don't think that anybody becomes a writer to get stuck in a corner, so.
Yeah, it's also interesting because we read Maggie Nelson in class today, and that's just someone who so firmly has her own kind of brand. So it's really interesting to see who has range, who has, their one very specific kind of specialty. But I wonder, across everything that you write, do you feel like they're united in any kind of same search for something or same pursuit? Or do you think there is a through line that you can think of?
Yeah, well, I think that, I think that a lot of my work is about actually searching in some way. And so whether it's, fiction or not, but especially in the narrative work, right? I think a lot of times my characters are, they're looking for something, whether it's like a sense of safety or, a way to create meaning in their lives or a way to feel less lonely. So that's really what I would say.
That's interesting. I also am curious, how do you access characters who, like, maybe their positionality is very different from yours? How do you kind of enter into writing those kinds of characters, if that makes sense?
Well, I think when you're writing, especially if you're writing a story that's in the first person and it's a character who has a different positionality, for me, it's like I don't really start writing the narrative until I have the sentence in my mind that in some way encapsulates the voice. So if I can look at the sentence and say, like, this feels distinctly like it's this character, then I proceed. And otherwise, I just don't write the character at all. You know? I just think, oh, I had an idea for, for a plot. You know.
I'm also curious. How do you generate, or what are your sort of rituals around writing? Do you have certain texts that you find yourself returning to, or music to kind of inspire you?
I do. I read a lot when I'm writing, and usually I actually start my writing day or whatever, writing a couple hours or whatever I'm doing by reading. So, I'll read. I usually have some, I'll be drinking coffee, like a lot of coffee. Until recently, I was a smoker, so there was also a lot of smoking involved. Now there's a lot of juuling involved, and now jewels are I don't know, or like no longer FDA approved or something. I don't know. There's a jewel issue. There's a jewel pipeline issue. I don't understand what it is exactly, but so now it's pretty soon it's not going to really be jewel. It's going to be like some other thing. But but basically it's it's pretty simple. It's just reading and writing, and I'll take a walk, something like that. I used to have a miniature trampoline in my apartment, which was great because it's like sometimes you're sitting for so long, and you kind of start feeling like this disgusting sense of I don't know, all your blood pooling into your ass or something. I don't even know, but you've been sitting so long, right? You're like, I can't possibly be coming up with anything new in my brain when my body is so still, right? So I'll get up and walk around or something for a little while. I come and sit down again, and that's pretty much it.
That's really interesting. I haven't heard that echoed before, but I have the same thing when something's really working. I immediately have to move my body in some way. I have to leave my desk and walk around. That's really interesting. I'm wondering how often you repurpose works, or, it kind of is similar to my first question, but when something isn't working, how often do you find that it was actually suited for a future project or anything like that?
Well, not very often, honestly, but recently I've been working on a memoir. And so I do find myself reusing material. So in a couple different ways. So one, obviously writing is an important part of my life. And, when you try to write about yourself, you find yourself realizing that it's particular moments, maybe writing a line or having your attention, sort of gathered around a particular narrative for so long is, it's just an event in your life, or it's become a part of how you can sort of convey who you were at a specific period, So I've ended quoting myself, which is, it feels a little bit ludicrous, but there's some of that. And then also I've been pulling from some old personal essays that I had written. But I do find that I'm sort of finessing them. And the book isn't done yet, but I believe that by the time it's finished, they'll, even the parts that I've reused will be quite different. But, I think in terms of, somehow moving them into the text, right? You might be sort of landing on, let's say, a structure, like a scene structure that was working. So you maybe put it there, and then as you're working at cohering the style or, whatever later, you might end up sort of, playing with it a little bit. But so recently I've been reusing more, but I never do that in fiction. So yeah.
Well, I think I can open it up to the group. What questions do we have out here? Are we doing the passing ritual?
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned that you were working on a memoir, and I was wondering what your approach to dialogue in memoir is, because I always feel like I have such bad recall about the actual words in a conversation I had. And yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, so I'll tell you that it's a bit of a funny situation because some of the conversations that are in the memoir I had recorded to begin with, which it sounds psychopathic, and I'm not going to deny it. No, so essentially, so the memoir is about, during the pandemic, I basically decided to try to find my mother, and so I at some point decided that maybe the best way to do it was going to be trying to hire a private investigator, so some of the phone calls that we had were recorded because, first of all, I was trying to find her myself also, and I wanted to remember absolutely everything that he said because he was giving me a lot of tips, let's say, right? And so essentially this guy, he was like a former CIA operative, and he didn't really take my case exactly, but he just sort of would have these phone calls with me and give me advice. So, those, I just sort of, it's like verbatim, right? So it's just what I use from it and what I don't, right? And then other parts, it's like I have, there's some conversations that I had with one particular woman who I didn't record, but there were certain phrases that I remembered really, really well because they were, I thought, very weird. So like at one point she said to me, like, she's like this social worker, and she, I was trying to find out if she knew where this woman had kept notes that would have identifying information on my mother. And so she, so she looked at me at some point. She was asking me about myself, and and I was like, "Well, what do you want to know?" And she said, like, "Well, do you have children? Like, are you married?" So on. I was like, "No, I have like 2 books, a PhD, and a mutt." So she said, "Oh, you graduated." And she was so surprised. And I said, "Yes, I graduated." And then she said, "You graduated. A lot of the children don't graduate." And like, I thought it was really funny that she said a lot of the children don't graduate. So I remembered that really well. She was talking about, children who, who don't grow up with their parents. So, but it was such a strange locution. So it's like those things are like that. But, some of the stuff is summarized. Like she told me this story about, about her daughter at one point. And, that's, summarized, right? And then some of the later dialogue, I haven't actually gotten to yet, but like there are parts that I'm, that I do kind of have saved because, what ended up happening is that I went to Korea, and I did find my mother, who I hadn't seen since birth, but she doesn't speak English and I don't speak Korean, so we were like using Google Translate, and obviously it doesn't translate in any sort of elegant way, but as we were going, I was like, oh, I might never like see this person again, and so like sometimes she would say things, and I would like immediately like take a screenshot as it was coming up in Google Translate because I wanted to remember. So yeah. What else do we have?
Hi, I'm wondering what kind of writing communities you found yourself a part of. If you have a lot of writer friends that are your primary readers, how you engage with other writers and how that's been helpful. I can just
I will tell you that when I was starting out, I really didn't have any writer friends. So when my first book came out, I didn't know anybody. I remember my agent at the time being like, he was like a very sweet guy, and he was worried about me. He was like, "You don't know anybody," and I was like, "Yeah, no, I don't know anybody." And so he like tried to bring me to like a party for Book Expo America for BEA. I don't know if you guys know what that is. But it's like, I used to always be in New York City. I think now they alternate cities, but I used to always be in New York City. It was the Javits Center. And there'd be sort of like satellite parties, when that happened. And so he was like taking me around and trying to introduce me to people so that I would have writer friends, But now, now I have a lot of writer friends, but I don't necessarily trust a lot of them with my work. And so what I mean by that is that like I have a lot of friends who are writers and I like them a lot as people, and I respect, that they have their practice and whatever. But in terms of who, I want to see show a draft to, I don't show very many people because first of all, it's a big ask outside of an MFA program, right? To ask somebody to read something. And for me, I've sort of realized that I almost never really like need the second eyes on like something short, like a short story. What I tend to need help with is like a long project, right? So if I'm writing a book, like I might want somebody to look at it, but that's asking a lot of somebody to be like, hey, can you read this book? It's 450 pages, So I try to be very careful for one, because I don't want to be asking too much. But two, also I don't want somebody to bullshit me. Like I don't need affirmation or anything. So I have an immense enough ego as it is. And then there's also the aesthetic component, right? So it's like, whose work are you also interested in, and like what types of books do you know that they like reading? And it's only really, I think, after knowing people for a while that you really understand the books that they read and sort of what their interests are and like what they think is important as a writer, and can figure out, if they would be suitable, somebody suitable to show a long project like that too. Recently I did join a writing group, and I think I'm already like, the number that's sort of lagging behind, and like I missed the last one. It can be useful, certainly, I think, to be in a group and to hear very different people's opinions along the way. And sometimes not even for the reasons you think. I mean, sometimes for me, even if somebody, is interested in reading very different work than what I produce, sometimes I can translate, or I feel as though I can translate what their feedback is into something that is sort of useful to me. So, for instance, I think a lot of times readers, when they're struggling with the pacing of something, they'll often use other terms, right? They don't necessarily know that like what the problem is pacing, but I know that that's what it is. So, yeah.
I mean, I'm just curious to hear more about your revision process. That you don't typically need second eyes on a short story is really interesting to me. How long has it been that way, or how did it kind of get to be that way? That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I might be incorrect about this. Like, let's be clear. I might, but I think that, a lot of times when I'm doing short fiction, and to be fair, I don't write a lot of short fiction. But a lot of times when I'm working in that form, I'm working at a much smaller scale, right? I know that it's some sort of character-driven problem, right? I sort of understand the shape it's going to be in, and once I hit on the voice, you know, that's that carries it, right? And a lot of times my short fiction is like a little bit funnier than my longer work. My father actually recently said to me, you know, I think what your problem is, Tracy, is that your books are never funny. And he was like, you're funny. So like, why aren't your books funny? And I was like, well, you know, it's really hard to be funny for like 450 pages. But yeah, I think at length, right, it's like one of the reasons that maybe I want somebody to look at the work is that I'm wondering about if there feels as though there's a sense of continuity to to somebody reading it, if they are feeling as though things are changing in the narrative, so on and so forth. But I think a lot of it has to do with like continuity and coherency, because I think with book length work, I often have more impulse to sort of make like strange structural choices, and like many, right? So it's like, it's very easy in a way, right, to do something structurally experimental in a short story because it's just smaller, right? But if you're like, well, I wonder if I can get away with like trying these like 18 things or whatever, however many things, right, that you end up trying in the course of a longer book, you might want to. So like, for instance, I did, and I don't usually do this, but I did send a chapter to a friend recently, and he's not a writer, but he's a big reader. This is my best friend from college, and he's a conceptual artist. And so I sent him this chapter because I knew that I was making some very self-aware moves in the chapter. Like I sort of made this a couple of meta leaps within the chapter. And so I was sort of curious if he could follow where we were in time, as these movements were made. And also, if it felt as though I was leaning too heavily on the act of writing as sort of the narrative in that chapter, as sort of like the sort of locus of action. And, also whether he felt jarred at the moment in which the first meta move happened, because it happened sort of like a couple of sections into the chapter.
I was also wondering, you mentioned starting your memoir during the pandemic. Overall, was lockdown generative for you, or how did that affect your writing practice? And does it still have an impact?
Well, I think the first few months of the pandemic, or first handful of months or something, I did write a lot, partially because I had a book coming out. So I was writing pieces and, trying to get them out there. But around the time of when the book begins, actually, I really stopped writing for a while, and which is very unusual for me. And I sort of, it's not that I didn't try to write, but I wasn't producing a lot. And then I sort of gave myself like a go ahead to really not. I also kind of gave myself a go ahead not to write in some ways. And so the story that I was reading from the beginning of today was like the one short story that I wrote. It was like the one thing I finished that in like all of 2021. No, I did one other thing. I did like one book review besides that, but like for me, that's not a lot, to do in a year. So so, it wasn't, but at the same time, I think the book project that I'm working on, what it was generative in the sense that I think like the book is so much about in a way that period, and I'm not sure, and I certainly wouldn't have necessarily arrived at, I think, the sense of urgency that I felt in that particular moment around finding this person, I think, if the pandemic hadn't happened, right? Because it's like, I think there's something about, older people dying and feeling like, this is like maybe something that has to happen now, right? Before this person like maybe kicks it or something, and also the sense of like isolation too, that it's like something that could be so fixated on. So in that way it was very generative, even if I wasn't literally writing, like 1,000 words a day or something. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? Okay, well, if not, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Can I take this?